My name is Curtis Anderson, and I'm the Director of Urban Outreach for Crown Ministries. So Crown Ministries has been an existing organization that started by Larry Burkett in 1976. He has a really, really wonderful story, but he did a lot of biblical empowerment and biblical literacy throughout America. And so during that time period, this organization was the leaders of a lot of economic development and understanding the godly principles of how to manage God's money. Then they went overseas into international communities like the Latino world and Africa, and they started developing all of these workshops and these concepts. So they've been doing this for some years, and they're still doing their work in the U.S. as well. We're at the Abiding Fathers Forum, and we're having a lunch forum, and we're here to talk about fatherhood and, you know, for me, the restoration of fatherhood. So, yeah. I think that there's several reasons. I think that sometimes these are triggering words, like some people say systemic racism, some people just say individual, just your individual choices that you've made. And I think that the balance aspect of that is that both things have happened. But, you even look at like the Atlantic slave trade and things that have happened in our country, and I wouldn't really call it great, but one of the methods that they did is they took the father out. Now, what we understand through the Bible is that the importance of the father and how important the father is. If you take the father out the home, our penitentiaries are full, school dropouts is happening, juvenile delinquency, all of those aspects are done because of the father being absent. My dad didn't grow up with his father, but because my dad was present in our house and he did the best that he could, that helped me. But across all communities, even in Africa, it's the absence of the father. It is the foundation to everything happening. And I think that we're just living in a different world now. And I think that our world is fighting against the imago Dei. God created us in his image, male and female, and there are cultural mandates. We are to have dominion, be fruitful, and multiply. And I think that we've gotten away from that, and we need to take that biblical manhood back, the thing that God has given us. And I think that when you look into the community that I come from, we are just, it's a pandemic of fatherlessness and all of those things. What I would tell a young kid that's 13 years old and without a father is, first of all, it starts with the relationship. You have to develop a relationship with him because he only knows what he knows. And that young man that may be on the block that he's around, his neighborhood that he's familiar with, that's all he sees. And he's going to flock towards something that's very familiar to him. So we got to be that familiar presence. We got to step in there and just use the aspects that we have in the gospel of love. And you got to sit in there with that young man and know that you're present in reality. And I think that we have to learn the difference between a transaction and transformation and being, I call it relational equity. Are you really, really going to be there for him? So for a young man that's attracted to his context, number one, I'm not going to put a fault game on him either, because just like him, many of us would be doing the same thing. If you didn't have that presence around you, you would be following the very things in him. So what I've done also is understanding the brokenness of the gospel is I can be just like him. When I see him, I see myself. And so here I am giving this kid an opportunity to see a present reality. But I also looked at this, man, working in tough communities, is that you either, you plant a seed, and sometimes you come along and you prune and you cultivate because a seed has already been planted. But you have to realize that, because one of the things that keeps me into working in these hard communities is that I'm only here in this person's life for a short term, but also I'm either planting the seed or I'm already cultivating, but it gets me away from being able to have unrealistic expectations on this kid that I'm working with. To that father that probably lives with a lot of guilt and shame that wasn't there for his kid, I always tell people one of the greatest stories in the Bible is the cankerworm, to where it says in the Bible that I'm going to take back all that the cankerworm has stolen from you. And we serve a God of abundance, and he will give us back the very things that we thought we lost. And as I was talking earlier about that man in Gadarenes, he wanted to go with Jesus then, but he said, go back home. And he went back into the places, and this man probably did all kind of damage. The man in Mark chapter 5, he probably did all kind of damage. He probably hurt a lot of people. He probably did a lot of things. But once he's been restored, he has to enter into that, because many of us have this guilty voice in the back of our minds that's telling us what we shouldn't do. It's been controlling us for a long time, and now we have to get out of that habitual process of listening to that. I always tell people all the time, I can be reminded of the mistakes that I make, and it's like a pink fence. And I'm always saying, I'm not going to think about the pink fence. I'm not going to think about it. And wonder what I wind up doing? Thinking about the pink fence. But how can I build a blue fence? How can I build the blue fence? Because when I build the blue fence, I'm not thinking about the pink fence. So for that man out there who's beating himself up all the time and who's talking about that they don't feel worthy and all of that, and I was that type of person. You didn't have to tear me down. I was already tearing myself down. I had a built-in inferiority complex in who I was. But now that I know who I am in Christ and I know what he has done for me, I can build on the blue fence and I can stay focused on that. It's just always, many of us, man, we live in life in the past, but how can we live for life through the future where God has me? I think that was beautiful what you said. I was in South Africa, and South Africa has the apartheid, it's not longer there, but you have, they have the Boers, who are the white English, and then the Afrikaans. They're all divided. Then you have the coloreds, who are mixed with white and black. They have their own group. Then you have the indigenous blacks. Then you have the Indians. And then I'm just like, what caused this? And I look at the bigger philosophical reasoning behind it, and it's based upon an attack towards God's Imago Dei. Desmond Tutu came up with a concept called Ubuntu. And it says in there, and there's something that I just loved in there, what he said. He said that if you are a person of color, black, whatever you want to call it, the beauty of my color doesn't come out until I'm up against another color. And I think that's where, God sees, in the Bible, they see color in heaven. When in Revelation, it talks about, I've seen every tribe, every tongue worshiping at the feet of the Lamb. There's beauty in who I am, but I was always told to hate what I have. But I think there's several factors of the caste system in India. All of these things that are happening where they're having this division between the darker and the lighter and all of that. In slavery, for African-American circles, there was something called the field slave and the house slave. And the house slave was allowed to be in the house because he was of lighter skin and he had, the master's blood in him. And the darker skin would be out there in the field. And there's this division even in my community over dark skin versus light skin. And it's based upon, I remember when I was a kid, we would be outside. My mom was real fair skinned and my dad was real dark. But my grandparents would always say, people always say, hey, don't get too dark out there. Come out the sun. Come out the sun. Like that was what was taught to us, that when I look at myself, there's no beauty behind that. And I'll say this real quick. There was one of the reasons why the Civil Rights Bill passed was Thurgood Marshall was approached by a man named Kenneth B. Clark, who was a black psychologist. And as they were trying to process, what do we do with America and how we do these? And I always tell people, color is a social construct, because even in African-American spaces, economics is a bigger factor, because you can take a person who's middle class and they won't have anything to do with somebody else who's from another class of people. But Kenneth B. Clark came in with this concept, the black doll test. And he put these dolls in front of an African-American girl, and he would put her up there, and he would have a white doll and a black doll. And he would say, all right, tell me about the black doll. And she was like, it's evil, it's ugly, all negative connotations. Then when they put the white doll in front of her, she was like, it's pure, it's beautiful. And here's an innocent child that sees something like herself and has a negative aspect to what that is. And so the subliminal effects of what that did and how that happened made them transition to thinking, and that's where the Civil Rights Bill was passed. But I think, if you think about Martin Luther King, who got assassinated before all of these bills were passed, I think that there should have been some due governance of how this plays out, how this works. And I think a lot of people, like my mother-in-law and different people who grew up in segregation, there was never a place to where you can talk about social trauma and all the things that happened to me. I remember one time sitting with my dad in a restaurant, in this famous restaurant we eat, and he just started kind of tearing up because he looked back there in the kitchen and he said, man, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we all, as African-American, had to sit back there in the back of that kitchen, back over there. And now I can sit out here with my family. And I witnessed that. But I also noticed that my dad, them, in that whole culture, they had an inferiority complex. They didn't love who they were because they were taught to be something else. Can you imagine growing up and looking at a place and it tells you, because of the color of your skin, this is where you belong. And because of the color of my skin, this is where I belong. And you see this every day being played out in your mind. You start believing that I only can go so far in this culture and there's not much that I can do because of who I am. And then how do you celebrate that I'm created in the image of God, but the culture is telling me that I can only do certain things. So I think that this has been this built, deep, entrenched thought process for many of us of how we think that we're something else, but we can exemplify something else that God has called us to be, and it takes a process to believe that. When I go into the communities and I see these kids that are settling for less, that's because that has been entrenched in their mind that this is all that I can do. And they feel trapped and they're arrested in their thinking. But when does it come to the point to where we can tell them in Christ and through who God has called you to be, you can get out of that shaped process of what somebody else is telling you and live into the real reality. I remember one time in the Imago Day, my car got broke down and I was in a far, far place in Texas in the middle of nowhere. And I was like, oh my goodness, because sometimes, as for me, sometimes you get nervous when you get outside into another place because sometimes you don't know who looks, there's nobody that looks like you, so you kind of get nervous. And a guy pulls up to me in this truck. He had all of this Trump Republican stuff all on his truck. And I'm like, okay, something is about to go down here. I don't want that guy helping me. It was like, some years back. I put all these prejudgments on this guy. And this guy was the nicest person I'd ever met. He took me to the gas station. He just looked out for me. And I looked at myself and I said, I have to continue to fight to not allow the news and other people to pollute me. That, person can, I am not, if you ever have a conversation with me, you can't tell if I'm a Republican or a Democrat. I'm God's kingdom. That's what I'm all about. But we have to stop having presuppositions about other people. That guy was the greatest guy in the world. And I think sometimes we need to give people a chance because we all bleed red, man. We all bleed red.